By the eighth night in the spring of 1926, somewhere on a cattle ranch in western Oklahoma, the pit bull came back through the windbreak on his own. Belly low, eyes fixed straight ahead on something behind the ranch house nobody standing in that yard would turn around to face. His name was Rook, and 7 nights earlier he'd chased a jackrabbit down the lane between the cottonwoods and never came back. Now he was home, but the hide along his spine radiated heat. Actual heat you could feel from 3 feet away, even though the evening air had turned cool enough to see your breath. And when Jesse Whitlow knelt down and touched the dog's collar, the metal tag burned his fingertips. He pulled his hand back fast. The tag showed fresh filing marks along one edge, bright scratches through old rust, and stamped into the soft backside of the metal was yesterday's date, April 19th, 1926. Not the day Rook disappeared. Yesterday, the day before he came home. Men in Oklahoma still won't talk much about that spring, but they remember the dog, and they remember what Buck Halter, the foreman, told the ranch hands after the 8th night. If you hear a dog breathing where there isn't one, get inside and don't turn around. The ranch sat in open prairie country where the red dirt went flat and wide under a sky that pressed down hard most afternoons. Cottonwoods lined the stock lane running east from the main house toward a dry creek bed nobody bothered to name. The air out there always carried the smell of dust and cattle and old wood soaking up spring rain. 15 men worked the property that season. Cowboys, fence riders, a cook, 2 boys who did water duty and barn work. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's horse, everyone's saddle, everyone's dog. Jesse Whitlow was 31 years old that spring. Steady man, quiet. He'd worked the same bunkhouse for 6 years and never missed a morning count. People trusted him to ride fence alone because he didn't waste daylight and he didn't spook easy. He kept Rook on a chain near the barn most nights, but the dog had run loose during the day since he was a pup. Rook was 3 years old in 1926. Dark brindle coat, white blaze down his chest, strong jaw, calm eyes. He'd never run off before, not once. On the evening of April 12th, just before sunset, Jesse was walking back from the horse trough when Rook saw the jackrabbit. It broke from cover near the windbreak and bolted east down the stock lane. Rook took off after it. Jesse whistled once. The dog didn't stop. Jesse watched him disappear into the cottonwood shadows, expecting him back in 5 minutes, maybe 10. Jackrabbits don't run long in open country. They tire fast or they find a hole. Either way, the dog comes back, but Rook didn't come back. By full dark, Jesse walked the lane with a lantern. He called the dog's name every 20 paces. Nothing. The cottonwoods stood silent. The ground showed rabbit tracks and dog tracks heading east, but no tracks coming back. Jesse walked all the way to the dry creek bed, half a mile past the windbreak, and found nothing. No blood. No fur. No sign the dog had stopped running or turned around, just the tracks going out and then bare ground where the clay turned to rock and scrub. He came back to the ranch house after midnight and told Buck Halter the dog was gone. Buck said to wait till morning. Dogs wander. Dogs chase. They come back when they're hungry. But morning came, and Rook didn't. That first full day, April 13th, 3 men rode the fence line east and south, checking for breaks, calling the dog's name into the wind. They found nothing. No carcass, no fur snagged on wire, no sign he'd tangled with coyotes or gotten himself caught in a fence gap. One of the younger hands, a boy named Clem, said he thought he heard chain links tapping together out past the barn sometime after midnight. That soft metallic sound a dog makes when he's pacing on a lead. But when Clem went outside with a lantern, there was nothing there. Just the empty hook on the barn post where Rook's chain usually hung during the day. On the second night, April 14th, 2 more men heard it. The sound of chain links dragging slow across hard ground, somewhere out near the stock tank on the east side of the property. They went out together with lanterns and a rifle. The night was still. No wind. They could hear their own boot falls crunching in the dry grass. And underneath that, faint but clear, the soft rhythmic scrape of metal on clay. They followed the sound to the stock tank, a wide, shallow concrete basin that caught runoff from the roof of the equipment shed. The sound stopped the moment they got close. They swept their lanterns over the area. The ground around the tank was damp from recent rain, the clay soft enough to hold a clear print. And there were prints, dog prints, but only in one spot, near the north edge of the tank. 4 paw prints pressed deep into the wet clay, as if the dog had stood there for a long time, weight shifted forward. But there were no prints leading to that spot, and no prints leading away. Just those 4, isolated, pointing east toward the windbreak. And then, 10 feet south of those, another set. Same size, same depth. Pointing west, back toward the barn. The 2 men looked at each other. Neither one said anything. They walked back to the bunkhouse and didn't talk about it until the next day. On the 3rd night, April 15th, the cook heard a low whine coming from under the wooden platform behind the kitchen. She was washing the last of the supper pans when she heard it, a soft, broken sound like a dog in pain. She set the pan down and stepped outside. The whine stopped. She called Rook's name. Nothing. She went back inside, and a minute later the whine started again. This time she didn't go out. She finished the dishes and went to bed and told Buck Halter about it the next morning. He sent 2 men to check under the platform. They found nothing, no fur, no scat, no sign any animal had been there in weeks. By the 4th day, April 16th, the whole ranch knew the dog was gone, and they knew something about the way he was gone didn't sit right. Jesse stopped eating much. He'd ride fence alone and come back after dark, looking older than he had in the morning. A few of the men started saying the dog must have gotten bit by a rattler and crawled off to die. Others said maybe he'd chased that rabbit clear into the next county, and some other ranch had taken him in, but nobody really believed it. Dogs don't vanish like that. Not for days. Not without a trace. On the 5th night, April 17th, one of the boys on water duty swore he saw Rook standing at the far end of the stock lane, just inside the shadow of the cottonwoods. He said the dog was facing the ranch house completely still, and that his eyes caught the lantern light and glowed pale green. The boy called out. The shape didn't move. He started walking toward it, and the shape turned and melted back into the trees without a sound. When the boy reached the spot, there was nothing there. But the ground was warm. He put his hand flat on the dirt, and it was warm like something had been lying there in the sun all afternoon. Except it was night, and the ground everywhere else was cool. On the 6th night, April 18th, nobody heard anything. The ranch was quiet. The men slept uneasy, but nothing woke them. It felt like waiting. And then, on the evening of April 19th, the 7th full day since Rook disappeared, Jesse was walking back from the horse trough just before sunset when he saw the dog coming up the lane. Slow, belly low, head down, eyes fixed on something behind the ranch house. Jesse stopped walking. The dog came closer. His coat looked clean, no mud, no burrs, no sign he'd been running wild for a week. But his whole body was shaking, a fine tremor that ran from his shoulders to his tail, and the air around him shimmered faintly, the way air shimmers over hot metal on a summer day. Jesse called his name. The dog didn't look at him, didn't wag, didn't break his stare toward the back of the house. Jesse stepped forward and reached for the collar. The metal tag burned his fingers, an immediate sharp heat that made him pull back with a hiss. He looked down at the tag. It was Rook's tag. Same dent on one edge from the time the dog had caught it on a fence wire. Same rust, but there were fresh scratches now. Bright silver lines filed across the surface like someone had dragged a blade over it. And on the back of the tag, stamped into the soft metal with something blunt and heavy, was a date. 4/19/26, April 19th. Yesterday. Not the day the dog disappeared. Yesterday. The day before he came home. Buck Halter was the first man besides Jesse to touch the dog that night. He came out of the ranch house when he heard Jesse calling his name, and he walked straight to where Rook stood shaking in the dirt. Buck had been foreman on that property for 11 years. He'd seen horses spook at nothing. Cattle refuse to cross certain ground. Men walk off a job because something in the air didn't sit right. He didn't scare easy. But when he knelt down next to that dog and put his hand near the animal's ribs, he felt it. Heat. Not normal dog warmth. Something else. Something that came off the hide in waves you could feel on your face from a foot away. He looked at Jesse. "How long's he been back?" "Just now," Jesse said. "Came up the lane maybe 2 minutes ago." Buck touched the collar. He jerked his hand back the same way Jesse had. The metal tag was hot enough to burn skin. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wrapped it around his fingers, and lifted the tag to look at it under the porch light. He saw the scratches. He saw the stamped date. He let the tag drop and stood up slow. "That's yesterday's date," he said. "I know." "You file that yourself?" "No." Buck looked east toward the cottonwoods. The last of the daylight was gone now, and the windbreak stood as a black line against a sky going from pink to deep blue. He looked back at the dog. Rook hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. His eyes stayed fixed on something behind the house, and his whole body trembled like he was standing in cold water, even though the evening was mild and his coat was dry. "Get him inside," Buck said. "Put him in the barn. Don't let him loose tonight." Jesse led the dog to the barn by the collar, using his shirt sleeve to hold the metal without touching it. Rook followed, but he walked stiff-legged, and twice he stopped and turned his head to look back toward the house. Not at the house, but past it, toward the open prairie behind the property. Jesse had to pull him forward both times. Inside the barn, Jesse chained him to the post and filled a water pail. The dog drank for a long time without stopping. Then he lay down on his side, still shaking, and closed his eyes. Jesse stayed with him for an hour. The heat coming off the dog's body didn't fade. If anything, it got stronger. By 10 o'clock that night, the barn smelled like hot metal, and the wood post where the chain was fastened felt warm to the touch. Jesse went to get Buck. The two of them stood in the barn doorway and watched the dog lying there in the dark, breathing fast and shallow, his ribs rising and falling under the thin hide. "That ain't natural," Buck said. "No," Jesse said. Buck told him to leave the dog chained and come back to the bunkhouse. They'd figure it out in the morning. But neither of them slept much that night. And by morning, the whole ranch knew Rook was back. The older hands in Oklahoma still remember what happened next, not because it was loud or violent, but because it was methodical. Buck Halter called every man on the property into the yard after breakfast on April 20th and made them go through the last 7 days, hour by hour, detail by detail, who saw what, who heard what, who was where and when. He wanted a timeline, he wanted facts, and what he got was a picture that didn't fit together no matter how many times he tried to square it. On the night of April 12th, the night Rook disappeared, 3 men were still awake past midnight. One of them, a man named Farrell who bunked on the north side, said he'd stepped outside to smoke around 1 in the morning and had seen a light moving slow along the stock lane, maybe a quarter mile out. He'd assumed it was someone checking fence with a lantern, so he didn't think much of it. But when Buck asked who'd been out there, no one spoke up. No one had been checking fence that night. On the night of April 13th, the boy named Clem swore he'd heard chain links tapping near the barn just after midnight. He'd gone outside and found nothing, but another hand, a man named Ortiz, said he'd heard it too, from inside the bunkhouse, lying in his cot. He said it sounded like someone dragging a dog chain slow across gravel, except there was no gravel near the barn, just hard clay. On the night of April 14th, 2 men had gone out to the stock tank after hearing the chain sound again. They'd found the dog prints in the wet clay, prints pointing 2 directions with no trail connecting them. Buck sent 4 men back out to the tank that morning to look again. The prints were still there, but now there was a 3rd set, smaller, pressed into the clay near the east edge of the tank. Fresh prints. And the clay around them was dry, even though it had rained overnight and every other inch of ground around the tank was slick and dark with water. On the night of April 15th, the cook had heard the whine under the kitchen platform. On the night of April 17th, the boy on water duty had seen the shape at the edge of the cottonwoods and felt the warm ground where nothing should have been lying. Every night something. Every night just enough to keep people awake and listening. But it was April 16th, the 4th day, the quiet day, that bothered Buck the most, because nothing had happened that night. No sounds, no sightings, no prints. And yet when the men went out the next morning to tie rag strips on the fence posts along the stock lane, marking a grid so they could search the area properly, one of the posts already had a strip tied to it, a clean white rag, knotted tight around the top of a post 60 yards past the windbreak. None of them had tied it. No one remembered seeing it the day before. But it was there, and the knot was the same kind Jesse always used when he was working fence. Could have been there a while, one of the men said. No, Buck said. We walked that line 2 days ago. That post was bare. They left the rag where it was and kept searching. They spread out in a line 10 men wide and walked east through the scrub and shortgrass prairie past the windbreak. They called Rook's name every few minutes. They checked every dip in the ground, every dry wash, every place a dog might crawl to die. They found nothing. No body, no bones, no fur. The land out there rolled gentle and open under a sky so wide it made you feel small, and there was nowhere for a dog to hide that a man on foot couldn't see from 50 yards away. By midday, they'd covered 2 square miles. They stopped to rest near a low rise where the ground turned rocky and a few stunted mesquite trees grew in a tight cluster. One of the younger men, a boy named Landry, said he smelled something burning. The others looked around. No smoke, no fire. But Landry was right. There was a smell. Faint, but sharp, like hot iron left too long on a forge. It hung in the air for maybe 10 seconds, and then it was gone. Nobody said much about it. They walked back toward the ranch in silence. That afternoon, Buck brought in 2 tracking dogs from a ranch 12 miles south. Good dogs, trained to follow scent through rough country. He led them to the spot where Rook had chased the rabbit into the cottonwoods, let them smell the ground and turned them loose. Both dogs started east down the stock lane, noses low, tails up. They made it about 100 yards past the windbreak, right to the spot where the white rag was tied to the fence post. And then they stopped. Both of them. At the same time. They sat down in the dirt, whined once, and refused to go farther. Buck tried to coax them, pulled the leads, walked ahead and called them. They wouldn't move. One of them started to shake. The other lay down flat and pressed his belly to the ground like he was trying to make himself invisible. Buck brought them back to the yard and sent them home with the man who'd loaned them. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. Everyone who'd been standing there watching knew what it meant. By the 6th day, April 18th, the search had become something else. The men still went out every morning, still walked the grid, still checked the fence line and the dry creek and the open country beyond the windbreak. But they weren't looking for a lost dog anymore. They were looking for an answer to something that didn't have a name. And the old hands and the ones who'd worked in Oklahoma long enough to know when land starts to feel wrong began telling the younger ones to stay close to the buildings after dark. Not because of coyotes or drifters, because of something they didn't say out loud. That night, April 18th, nothing happened. The ranch was quiet. No sounds, no lights, no prints. It felt like waiting. And then the dog came back. On the evening of April 19th, walking slow up the stock lane with his belly low and his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. And when they touched his collar, the metal burned their fingers. And when they read the tag, the date said yesterday. Buck stood in the barn that night with Jesse and 2 other men, watching the dog lying on his side near the post, still radiating heat that shouldn't exist. One of the men asked if they should take the collar off. Buck said no. He said they weren't going to touch that tag again unless they had to. He said the dog could keep it on, and they'd keep him chained, and they'd wait and see what happened next. But before he left the barn, Buck told them all the same thing he'd told Jesse earlier. If you hear a dog breathing where there isn't one, get inside and don't turn around. And he told them one more thing. Quiet and flat. The way a man speaks when he's already made up his mind and doesn't plan to argue about it. Nobody walks that stock lane alone before sunrise. Not anymore. 2 men or none. The men nodded. They didn't ask why. They already knew. By the morning of April 21st, The dog had stopped shaking. The heat was still there. You could feel it standing 2 feet away. But Rook was calmer. He ate a little, drank more water, let Jesse sit with him in the barn without pulling at the chain or staring past the walls. But he still wouldn't look anyone in the eye, and when the wind shifted and blew in from the east, from the direction of the cottonwoods, the dog would go rigid, and his ears would pin back flat against his skull, and he'd stay that way until the wind changed again. Buck kept his word about the stock lane. No one walked it alone before sunrise. No one rode fence past the windbreak without a second man. The rule spread fast, and no one questioned it. By the third day after Rook came back, even the men who'd laughed it off at first were pairing up without being told. Something about the way the dog had come home, the heat, the trembling, the filed tag with the wrong date, had settled into the bones of the place. It didn't need explaining. You felt it. On April 22nd, Jesse took the collar off. He used a thick work glove and a pair of pliers to pry the buckle open, and even through the glove he could feel the metal warm against his palm. He set the collar on a wooden crate in the corner of the barn and covered it with a folded canvas tarp. He didn't throw it away, didn't bury it. He just couldn't leave it on the dog anymore. Rook's neck had started to blister where the leather sat against the skin. Thin red welts that wept clear fluid when you touched them. The dog didn't fight when Jesse took it off. He just lay still and closed his eyes. And for the first time since he'd come back, he seemed to breathe easier. But that night, after everyone had gone to bed, one of the men got up to use the outhouse and saw a light in the barn. Not lantern light, something smaller. A faint orange glow like embers in a dying fire coming from the corner where Jesse had left the collar. The man, his name was Ortiz, stood outside the barn door for a full minute, watching that glow pulse slow and steady through the cracks in the wood. He didn't go inside. He went back to the bunkhouse, climbed into his cot, and didn't say a word about it until morning. When Jesse went to the barn at dawn, the glow was gone. The collar was still on the crate, still covered by the tarp. But the wood underneath it was scorched black in a perfect circle, and the canvas tarp had a burn hole the size of a silver dollar right over where the metal tag would have been resting. Jesse pulled the tarp back. The collar looked the same. Dry leather, dull metal buckle, the tag hanging from its ring scratched and dented. He touched it with one bare finger, fast, testing. It was cool, normal. He picked it up and turned it over. The date was still there, stamped into the back, 4/19/26. He showed Buck. Buck looked at the scorched wood, looked at the burn hole in the canvas, looked at the tag. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he told Jesse to put the collar in a tin box and keep it in the tack room, away from anything that could catch fire. Jesse did. He found an old biscuit tin, lined it with sand, laid the collar inside, and sealed the lid tight. He put the tin on the highest shelf in the tack room, behind a row of bridles no one used anymore, and he told himself that would be the end of it. It wasn't. On April 24th, a boy named Landry was cleaning out the tack room when he knocked over a bridle and the tin box fell off the shelf. It hit the floor hard, and the lid popped open. The collar spilled out onto the packed dirt. Landry bent down to pick it up, and when he lifted the tag to drop it back in the tin, he stopped. He stood there for a long time, holding the collar by the buckle, staring at the tag. Then he walked out of the tack room, across the yard, and straight to where Buck was standing near the corral. "Sir," Landry said. His voice was shaking. "You need to see this." Buck took the collar. He looked at the tag. Front side first, same scratches, same dent. Then he turned it over. The date was still there, but it wasn't 4/19/26 anymore. Now it read 4/24/26, April 24th. Today. Buck looked at Landry. "You do this?" "No, sir." "You touch this tag, file it, stamp it?" "No, sir, I swear." Buck called Jesse over, showed him the tag. Jesse went pale. He'd looked at that tag 3 days ago when he'd put the collar in the tin. He'd seen the date. 4/19/26, he was sure of it. He'd checked it twice, turned it over in his hand, read the numbers carefully because they'd seemed impossible then and he wanted to be certain. It had said April 19th. He was sure. Now it said April 24th. Buck sent Landry back to work and told him not to talk about what he'd seen. Then he took the collar into the ranch house, into the small office where he kept the property ledgers and the pay records, and he locked it in the bottom drawer of the desk. He didn't tell anyone where he put it. He didn't explain why. He just locked the drawer, pocketed the key, and walked back outside. That night, sitting on the porch with Jesse and two of the older hands, Buck said what a lot of them had been thinking, but no one wanted to say out loud. That dog didn't just wander off and come back, something took him. And whatever it was, it sent him home with a message. One of the men, a quiet fellow named Farrell who'd worked cattle in Oklahoma for 20 years, said, "What kind of message?" "I don't know," Buck said, "but it's in that tag. And it keeps changing." "Changing how?" Jesse asked. "To today's date. Every time we look at it, it's today." They sat with that for a while. The night was cool and clear, and you could hear the cattle shifting in the pasture and the cottonwoods rustling in the wind down by the stock lane. Somewhere far off, a coyote called once and went silent. Farrell said, "Some say that land past the windbreak never gives back what it takes." "Who says that?" Buck asked. "Old hands. People who've been here longer than us." "You ever lose anything out there?" "No, but I knew a man who did. Years ago, before you came on. He lost a horse past that dry creek. Good horse. Rode out one morning and the horse came back that afternoon with an empty saddle. Saddle was still warm, stirrups still swinging. They never found the man." Jesse looked at him. "What did they do?" "They stopped riding out there alone. Same rule you made, Buck. 2 men or none." Buck nodded slowly. He looked out toward the windbreak, toward the dark line of cottonwood standing against the stars. "You think it's the land?" "I think it's something," Farrell said. "I think there's places that don't work the way they're supposed to. And I think that lane's one of them." The next morning, April 25th, Buck opened the desk drawer to check the collar again. The tag still read 4/24/26. He exhaled, relieved in a way he didn't want to admit. Maybe it had stopped. Maybe whatever had been changing it was done. He closed the drawer and locked it again. But that afternoon, when he opened it to show one of the ranch hands who'd been asking questions, the date had changed. Now it read 4/25/26, April 25th, today. Again, Buck stopped showing people the tag after that. He stopped talking about it. He left the collar locked in the drawer and told everyone to let it alone. But word had already spread through the ranch. The men knew, and the knowing changed things. Some of them said the dog had been marked by something out past the windbreak, something that could touch metal and skin and time itself. Others said Jesse should have put the dog down the night he came back, that it wasn't right to keep an animal that had been touched like that. A few said nothing at all, but they started sleeping with their boots on and a lantern lit low near the bunk, and they stopped going outside after dark unless they had to. The women who came to cook and clean started leaving before sunset. One of them, an older woman named Mrs. Hargrove who'd worked the ranch kitchen for years, told Buck flat out that she wouldn't stay past 4 o'clock anymore. He asked why. She said, "Because I don't like the way the air feels out here after the sun goes down. It feels like something's waiting." Buck didn't argue with her. By the end of April, the whole character of the ranch had shifted. The work still got done. Cattle still moved, fence still mended, horses still fed. But there was a tightness to it now, a watchfulness. Men counted heads more often, checked in with each other. No one strayed far from the buildings alone. And the stock lane, the long stretch of dirt road running east through the cottonwoods toward the dry creek, became a place people avoided unless they had no choice. Even in daylight, even in pairs, men rode that lane fast and didn't look too long at the shadows between the trees. Rook stayed in the barn, chained and quiet. The blisters on his neck healed, but he never went back to the way he'd been before. He ate, he drank, he slept. But he didn't play, didn't wag his tail, didn't come when called with any kind of enthusiasm. He just existed. like something in him had been hollowed out and not filled back in. Jesse stayed with him most nights, sleeping on a saddle blanket near the post, and sometimes in the deep hours before dawn he'd wake up and find the dog staring at the barn door, ears forward, body tense, like he was listening to something Jesse couldn't hear. On the night of May 2nd, Jesse woke to find the dog standing at the end of his chain, staring at the door, growling low in his chest. Jesse sat up. The barn was dark except for the faint moonlight coming through the gaps in the planks. He listened. At first, nothing. Then he heard it, soft and rhythmic, the sound of chain links dragging slow across hard ground, coming from outside, coming closer. Jesse stood up and walked to the barn door. He put his hand on the latch and stopped. The sound was right outside now, right on the other side of the wood. He could hear it clearly. Metal scraping on clay, deliberate and steady, like someone pulling a dog chain behind them one slow step at a time. He stood there, hand on the latch, heart pounding, and he did not open that door. He stepped back. The sound continued for another 10 seconds. Then it stopped. Jesse waited. Silence. He counted to 60. Then he opened the door fast and stepped out with a lantern raised high. The yard was empty. No one there, no dog, no chain. He swept the light across the ground, and there, in the dust, directly in front of the barn door, were 4 paw prints, deep and clear, pointing toward the house, and 10 feet closer to the house, another set, pointing back toward the barn. No trail between them. Just the 2 sets, facing each other, like something had stood in both places at the same time. Jesse went back inside, bolted the door, and didn't open it again until sunrise. By the second week of May 1926, 3 more men had quit the ranch. They didn't give much explanation, just said they'd found work closer to town or that family needed them elsewhere, or that the pay wasn't worth the distance anymore. Buck didn't try to stop them. He understood. The ranch had become a place where you worked with your head on a swivel and your eyes on the horizon, and not everyone could live like that. The men who stayed were the ones who'd been there long enough to feel responsible for it, or the ones who had nowhere else to go, or the ones stubborn enough to believe that whatever was wrong would eventually pass. It didn't pass. By June, Buck had moved Rook out of the barn and into a penned area behind the equipment shed, farther from the main buildings. The dog was calmer there, less agitated, though he still wouldn't look anyone in the eye and still went rigid when the wind came from the east. Jesse visited him every day, brought him food and water, sat with him in the evenings. But even Jesse had started to feel it, the sense that the dog he'd raised from a pup wasn't fully there anymore. Something had been taken, or something had been added, and either way Rook wasn't the same. The collar stayed locked in Buck's desk drawer. He checked it once a week, always in private, always bracing himself for what he'd see. And every time he opened that drawer, the date on the tag had changed. It was always today. Whatever day he looked, that's what the tag said. 5/7/26, 5/14/26, 5/21/26. Always today. He stopped checking after a while. It didn't matter what the date said. What mattered was that it kept changing, and there was no human way for that to happen. In July, a new hand arrived from a ranch east of Oklahoma City. Young man, good worker, didn't ask many questions. On his 3rd day, he asked Buck why no one used the stock lane past the windbreak. Buck told him the same thing he'd told everyone since April. 2 men or none, and not before sunrise. The young man asked why. Buck said, "Because that's the rule." The young man didn't ask again. By the end of his 1st week, he'd heard enough from the other hands to understand that the rule wasn't arbitrary. It was survival. That same month, Mrs. Hargrove brought her daughter to help with the cooking. The daughter was 16, sharp-eyed, curious. On her 2nd afternoon at the ranch, she found the tin box in the tack room, the one Jesse had used before Buck moved the collar to the desk. It still smelled faintly of scorched canvas. She asked what it was for. Mrs. Hargrove took the tin from her hands, put it back on the shelf, and told her, "Some things you don't need to know about. This is one of them." By August, the story had spread beyond the ranch. Men in town started asking questions. What happened out there in the spring? Why'd 3 good hands quit all at once? Why won't anyone ride that stock lane alone anymore? The men from the ranch didn't say much. They'd shrug, or change the subject, or offer some vague explanation about coyotes or rough ground, but the truth was already moving through the county the way these things do. Quietly, in kitchens and feed stores and Sunday gatherings, passed along in low voices between people who knew that some stories don't need to be loud to be believed. By the fall of 1926, the rule was ironclad. No one walked or rode the stock lane alone before sunrise. No exceptions. Even Buck, who'd made the rule, followed it. And when the ranch hired new men over the winter, the older hands told them the same thing on their first day: 2 men or none. If they asked why, the answer was always the same: because that's how we do it here. In the spring of 1927, exactly 1 year after Rook disappeared, Jesse found the dog dead in his pen. No sign of injury, no blood, no struggle. Rook had just lain down in the dirt and stopped breathing. Jesse buried him behind the equipment shed, in a spot where the ground was soft and the sun came through in the mornings. He didn't mark the grave. He didn't tell many people. The dog had been gone in every way that mattered for a year. This was just the body catching up. A week after the burial, Buck went to his desk to check the collar one last time. He unlocked the drawer, pulled it open, and stopped. The collar was gone. The drawer was empty. He searched the office, checked the floor, the other drawers behind the desk. Nothing. He asked Jesse if he'd taken it. Jesse said no. He asked every man on the property. No one had touched it. The collar was gone, and no one could explain how. 3 days later, the new hand, the young man from Oklahoma City, was walking past the barn at dawn when he saw something lying on the ground near the door. He bent down to look. It was a dog collar, leather, worn, with a metal tag hanging from the buckle. He picked it up. The leather was warm. Not hot, but warm, like it had been sitting in the sun all afternoon even though the sun was barely up. He turned the tag over. On the back, stamped into the metal, was a date: 5/9/27, May 9th. Today. He brought it to Buck. Buck looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he told the young man to put it back where he found it and walk away. The young man did. When Buck went back an hour later to check, the collar was gone again. It reappeared twice more that year. Once in October, lying on the wooden crate in the corner of the barn where Jesse had first placed it. Once in December, hanging from a nail on the tack room wall, in a spot where nothing had hung for months. Both times the tag showed the current date. Both times Buck told whoever found it to leave it alone. And both times, by the next morning, it was gone. By 1928, people in Oklahoma had started talking about the ranch the way you talk about a place with a reputation. Not haunted exactly. No one used that word. But marked. Different. A place where the rules were stricter and the silences were heavier, and the old hands watched the younger ones a little more carefully than they did on other properties. When men came looking for work, the first thing they were told was the rule about the stock lane: 2 men or none. Not before sunrise. No one asked why anymore. They just nodded and followed it. Because by then it wasn't just a rule. It was a fact of the landscape, as fixed and immovable as the dry creek bed, and the cottonwood windbreak, and the red dirt that stretched flat and wide under that enormous sky. In 1932, the ranch changed hands. New owner, same operation. Buck stayed on as foreman. Most of the original hands were gone by then. Moved on, retired, died, but the rule stayed. The new owner asked about it once. Buck told him, "It's not negotiable." The owner didn't press. He'd heard enough by then to know that some rules exist for reasons you don't question out loud. In 1935, a boy who'd grown up on a neighboring property came to work at the ranch. He was 19 years old, strong, eager, and he'd heard the stories about the stock lane since he was a child. His mother had told him never to go there alone, and his father had told him the same, and now the men he worked alongside told him again. He followed the rule without question, the way you follow any instruction that's been repeated enough times to become reflex. He didn't need to know why. He just knew. In 1940, a reporter from a newspaper in Oklahoma City came out to the ranch to write a story about cattle operations in the western part of the state. He interviewed Buck, asked about the work, the land, the people. At the end of the interview, he asked about the stock lane. He'd heard there was a rule about it, something unusual. Buck looked at him for a long moment and then said, "We don't ride it alone before sunrise, that's all." The reporter asked why. Buck said, "Because we don't." The story ran without mention of the stock lane. The reporter had decided, somewhere between asking the question and writing the article, that it wasn't the kind of detail that belonged in print. By 1945, the last of the men who'd been there in the spring of 1926 had moved on. Buck was still there, older now, slower, but still firm on the rules. Jesse had left in 1938, taken work farther north, and no one had heard from him since. Farrell had died in 1941. Ortiz had gone back to Texas. The young man from Oklahoma City had moved to California. But the rule stayed, and so did the stories. Not the loud ones, the ones people tell at parties or write down for newspapers. The quiet ones, the ones passed from old hands to young ones on a slow afternoon, or late at night when the wind was up and the cottonwoods were rustling and someone asked, just once, why they did things the way they did. In 1950, a school teacher in a town 15 miles from the ranch mentioned the stock lane to her students during a lesson on local geography. She told them it was a place where men used to lose things, tools, animals, time, and that the people who worked there had learned to be careful. One of the students asked if it was haunted. The teacher said no. She said it was just a place where the rules were different, and if you followed the rules, you were fine. The students accepted that. It made sense in the way things make sense when you're young and the adults around you speak with certainty. But at night, alone in her small house on the edge of town, the teacher thought about the stories she'd heard over the years. About the dog that came back wrong, about the collar that burned and moved and changed its date, about the footprints that appeared in pairs with no trail between them, about the men who heard chain links dragging when no chain was there. And she thought about the question no one in that part of Oklahoma ever asked out loud. What kind of thing can touch metal and skin and time itself, and send a living creature home with a message no one can read? There were 3 versions of the story, depending on who you asked. Some said Jesse's dog had been stolen by drifters passing through, maybe tortured, maybe held for days before they let him go, and that the heat and the terror had done something to the animal's mind and body that looked supernatural, but wasn't. Others said the dog had gotten into something poisonous out past the windbreak, bad water, toxic plants, chemicals dumped by someone years ago, and that the strange symptoms were just the dog's body breaking down in ways that seemed impossible, but had a rational explanation if you looked hard enough. And a few, the ones who'd been there or whose fathers had been there or whose grandfathers had worked that land back when it was still wild, said it was neither of those things. They said the dog had gone somewhere he wasn't supposed to go, and something out there had noticed, and had sent him back with a mark that couldn't be explained by poison or cruelty or fear. A mark that changed dates and radiated heat, and left prints in the ground that pointed 2 directions at once. A mark that said, "This is what happens when you cross a line you can't see." People in Oklahoma still follow the rule. Not just on that ranch, and it closed in 1954. The land sold off and split into smaller parcels, but in the towns and properties around it. There are places out in that part of the state where people don't go alone before sunrise. Stretches of road where you keep a second person in the truck. Fence lines where the old hands tell the young ones, you walk that with a partner, or you don't walk it at all. No one writes it down. No one makes a fuss about it. It's just understood, and if you ask why, you get the same answer Buck gave 70 years ago. Because that's how we do it here. The collar shows up now and then. Someone finds it in a barn they're cleaning out, or on a fence post near an old stock lane, or in a toolbox that belonged to their grandfather. Always warm, always with a tag that shows today's date, and always, within a day or 2, it's gone again. No one keeps it. No one wants to. They just put it down, walk away, and let it move on to wherever it's supposed to go next. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in Oklahoma dares to say out loud? And what does it mean that a piece of metal can rewrite itself over and over, and no one has ever been able to stop it? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.